Hello, my name is Heidi Schlegel, and I'm the Associate Director of the School of Design and an Associate Professor of Interior Design at Rochester Institute of Technology in the United States.
And I'm Reem Fathallah, the Anti-Colonial Curriculum and Pedagogy Project Coordinator at the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design at the University of Toronto, Canada, and an adjunct faculty there as well. Although we are in a virtual space, we would just like to acknowledge the land on which we live and on which our universities operate. For those of you unfamiliar with land acknowledgements, it is typically defined as a formal statement respecting and recognizing the relationships between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories which sustain us. So Heidi and I would like to acknowledge that Toronto, Ontario has been a site of human activity for over 15,000 years, and its land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Similarly, Rochester, New York resides on the traditional territory of the Seneca people, who are one of the 6 nations in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, known as the People of the Great Hill and the Keeper of the Western Door. We honor these Indigenous communities' deep connection to the land, and we recognize the historical challenges of colonization. Mindful of this history, we are committed to understanding and acknowledging and working towards reconciliation. For Heidi and I, we consider this land acknowledgement a space for reflection on locating our identities in relation to the space we occupy. Similarly, this presentation focuses on the challenges faced by design students in untangling personal cultural identities and biases, which is why we entitled our presentation Sitting in Uncertainty, Untangling Personal Identities and Bias Towards Equity-Centered Design Education.
Traditional design education requires the first step of the design thinking process to be focused on analytic tasks, such as research, interviewing, case studies, and other activities to define the needs of the client or user of the products we create. But newer models of design thinking altered the terminology from analysis to empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of others as a means to achieving equity centered design. Most designers have increasingly become familiar with these steps of the design process seen on the screen. It is a process in which the designer embarks on a non judgmental attempt at understanding the target or eventual user of the design through, for example, interviews or shadowing. In the design process, it is important to be cognizant of the representation of diverse concerned parties, integrating all voices, including that of the designer. But designers need to be aware of their standing, opinion, biases, and cultural attitudes that may influence design decisions to be made through their own lens rather than through empathy with others. How can we shift from designing for to designing with? The question that arises: how can one engage in the design process through constructive relations and co creation within diversity if one does not understand the positionality of their self?
In 2016, the Stanford D School added 2 design modes to its design thinking model seeking equity centered design. These 2 modes were notice and reflect. These new steps involve, including other things, bringing more transparency around the self of the designer. Before transformative thinking and practice can begin, designers need to engage in a process of untangling the makeup of their identities. And you notice that identities is a term that we have intentionally pluralized to represent the multiple intersecting identities and culture as we all possess, and the systems of oppression they have been a part of or subjected to. Through this process, we can develop a greater potential for engaging diverse perspectives and inciting a new universal paradigm of inclusion and equity oriented design.
Our arguments for this presentation are supported by data collected during the 2021 and 2022 Cultural Synergy Charrettes from participating undergraduate interior design students and instructors. Cultural Synergy is an annual cyber charrette event that teams students from around the globe for a 2 week collaborative design experience, with 1 week for preparatory exercises and one design week. The topic of these particular charrettes focused on cultural identity and bias. Intended as a qualitative study on intercultural dialogue through design, data was collected through several means, including reflection logs, video footage of team members' interaction, individual and group interviews with students and faculty, post project surveys, and visuals of the process and the final projects.
In our transnational charrettes, one of the first tasks in the preparatory week that we expect students to perform had to do with a visual self-reflection on their culture. They performed this exercise individually prior to meeting their teammates. And because we know that culture is very complex, we gave them prompts, which you can see on the screen, to support students to think about their culture through various dimensions. Our goal was to go beyond stereotypical representations and to have students explore these various dimensions at a personal level to gain deeper understanding of their complex cultural experiences. Now, students were not expected to find visuals for all of these categories, just the ones that spoke to their identities. This exercise was expected to serve as a fulcrum for students to bring together into group dialogues for shared communication of culture. So students were supposed to share these visuals that they would have collected once they meet their transnational teammates.
These are examples of the outcomes of the preliminary cultural self reflection task. As you can see, many students weren't successful at personalizing their reflections, as some of these images remain stereotypical representations. During faculty debrief, one faculty member from Mexico commented on how many of his students had representations of Maya culture, but they clearly had no ancestral connection to this culture. He reported on a class discussion he had with his students during which he pointed out that being blonde haired and blue eyed, they probably had more ancestral relationship with Texans in the United States than Mayans. The faculty noted if you take the Mayan ruins out of their imagery, they're lost. In the following video, we're going to share with you students struggling with self identification. This particular instance took place after several minutes of quiet, where they were unable to sort of pinpoint even the meaning of culture.
I just want I looked up a definition just like cleared up in my head a little bit, and this is it's reading as cultural identity is the identity of belonging to a group. It's a part of a person's self-conception and self-perception and is related to nationality, ethnicity, religion, social class, generation, locality, or any kind of social group that has its own distinct culture. So I feel like that doesn't necessarily limit it to where we're from, but we can also, but obviously, where you're from is a big part of your self identity. So I feel like we don't have to shy away from that, but I feel like we can also reach out into like, okay, like interests and like what built you up as you grew and like what interests you had that kind of made you who you are, or um, yeah.
Pretty much just like the process work that we did with the pictures.
Yeah. I feel like we can look more towards that as, I feel like, well, we all did it. So if we want, we can like, we could possibly like present them to each other if we want.
Mine were extremely stereotypical because I couldn't come up with anything. Literally. Because I forgot it was due and I was like,
I looked up a definition just.
Now, here are some quotes that explain the different reasons why the students found it difficult to articulate their identities. One challenge had to do with multiple geographic belongings, and the first quote is an illustration of that. In the United Arab Emirates, for example, out of 16 students, only 2 were Emirati, while the remaining 14 originated from 11 different countries. And one of the students was studying virtually in the UAE while living in the UK, and her origins were from Nigeria. There were similar experiences in the US, not only by 3 international students, one from Canada, another from China, and one from Vietnam, but even by an American student who was originally from Chicago but currently living in New York. And this situation led students to the challenge of deciding which identity is closest to the self. We can see that illustrated in the second quote, in which the team member in the Emirates announced to her group that she was changing her approach from representing the UAE to representing her homeland Syria, because that's where she's from. Another challenge had to do with being detached from one's culture. In quote 3, the student describes how she had to undertake a research in order to learn about and connect with her origins. Another challenge had to do with having mixed feelings about identity. In the top quote by the student in the US, we can see how that student felt that some aspects of her identity she was proud of, but there were then other aspects that she felt a bit silly about. For some students, the challenge had to do with not being used to such an exercise, as reflected by the quote at the bottom of the screen by the student in the US who said that we're not used to confronting our own culture. Another challenge was that for some students, they needed more time for this activity, particularly because they were trying to personalize their visual presentation and not to make it stereotypical. And we can see that in the quote at the top. And lastly, the last two quotes were by faculty during the faculty debrief, and they revolve around a challenge stemming from the diverse nature of society. The USA-based faculty, for example, explained how the United States brings together a very rich diaspora, creating a lot of complexity around culture. The Mexico faculty echoed that he would struggle with self-identification as well.
Our data demonstrated the challenges that students faced in untangling and articulating their identities. Without the ability to self-define positionality, it became difficult to identify the biases that may be inherent in steering design decisions, creating barriers to effective implementation of the phases of equity-centered design, including empathy. As noted in the graph, 3 elements prove the most uncomfortable or challenging to students: reflecting on stereotyping and bias in both individual and collective exercises, and reflecting on stereotyping and bias with unfamiliar teammates. The highest numbers were noted in individual reflection on stereotyping and bias. For one student, it even triggered what was communicated as a severe episode of PTSD, as noted by the student in the post-project survey and through faculty interviews. This was notably the most difficult tasks that students encountered. In general, the charrette helps students examine cultural bias to different extents, and to many of them, this experience was transformed, and that their identity as designers, at least, will be more sensitive in the future to potential bias in their design process. This response takes us back to where we started with the importance of infusing opportunity for reflection into the design process if we're interested in equity-centered design.
So, our study has really shed the light on the importance for faculty to create for their students safe and flexible spaces for self-reflection and for self-identification. Truth be told, we were surprised with the unexpected research finding that many struggled across all locations in untangling their cultural identities. So we have learned that untangling should not be taken for granted, and that it requires self-reflection and reflexivity, which we have seen can be uncomfortable and uncertain for some students. We have also seen how self-identification was not only an individual, but a collective task as well. We saw in the video how students were helping each other to think about the articulation of what identity and culture is. We also noted that self identification is relational, as one might identify differently depending on who they are with, in this case, within their teams. And last but not least, we noted that process was more important than product because there were instances where culture and identity were not really visible in the final design teams, but the logs and the interviews had allowed us to see that very interesting conversation had indeed taken place. And that, to us, is a learning objective achieved.
We would like to invite you to share questions, comments, or engage in future cultural synergy global cyber charrettes. We always welcome additional collaborators. Please feel free to contact us directly if you are interested in learning more. Thank you for your time.